we can have some conversations about what works, what doesn't, what has been tried, and what we've seen as we have been working with folks on their soil health journey. And I think it's important that we realize that, it is a soil health journey that we're on with our producers. Traditions in agriculture have been going for many years. It used to be that we were doing everything by hand, and then horses or oxen. But all along we had to work with nature. We had to work within the systems that we had. And then, when we changed from having horses and oxen, and then we got some steel, some iron that went through the ground, and we're able to turn the soil over, eliminating some of those central plains grasslands. We continued to advance, and John Deere invented the steel plow in 1837, and that really led to a large scale advance of how soil management took place. And when I say soil management, it wasn't really soil management that we were doing. It led to the Dust Bowl, but it wasn't really soil management. All we were doing was turning the soil over and utilizing it. It really has not been until recently, probably within the last 30 years, that we really started to focus on the what's and the whys and the hows that we could manage our soil in order to make it more sustainable and better service. So when we think about soil, we have lots of different functions that we want soil to provide. And typically I'd be asking folks to shout up at me as I write on the whiteboard or write on a flip chart about what functions do we want soil to provide. But when you ask that question, everybody should have something in their mind about, well, this is what I want soil to be. This is what I see is a good benefit to the land management. But when we think about it, what do we want it to provide? Number one, for this group, for this presentation, we want it to be able to produce food, feed, fiber. Biofuels and medicine are a benefit. We want it to capture, filter, and store water. And, I know we're going to talk more, and you guys have been talking all week long about the opportunities of climate change and how soil is going to affect climate change. And capturing, filtering, and storing water is huge on that. Cycle and recycle nutrients. And that really is a big thing that agriculture is coming around to. I think everybody understands that 50% or more of the nutrients that a crop gets is already in the soil. It just needs to be processed. When we had the ability to manufacture nutrients and add nutrients from a manufactured perspective, that really changed how we dealt with and how we managed our land. Resilience to drought, flood, temperature extremes. Again, we're talking about climate change. We're talking about what is going on in the Pacific Northwest, what is going on in our world. We're seeing different scenarios coming up as we go through the years. Protecting plants from pathogens and stress. We're going to talk more about stress and what soil does, how soil can mitigate some of those stresses. Detoxify pollutants, store carbon, and moderate the release of gases. Storing carbon, I think everybody that's here, even though we're supposed to be in the 101 level, everybody understands what carbon does for soil health and moderating soil. And then the big one that we've kind of moved past is NRCS. We've moved past the key focus of it is resist the erosive forces. And when I say we move past, that doesn't mean we've solved the problem, because I think everybody has been able to drive around the countryside and see that, hey, there's still soil moving. There's still soil leaving the field. And, when we think about soil leaving the field, we need to think about the characteristics of soil function loss. If it's not in the place that we need it, it's not obviously going to be functioning the way we need it to. Degraded soils that have decreased functions really have telltale characteristics. As we think about it, there's a general agreement that weather events related to precip and temperature are becoming more extreme and unfortunately more frequent. And as we think droughts, the droughts are getting longer. The duration of them, unfortunately, we see them hanging on, going longer and longer. And I took the opportunity to go down to Northern California this spring, and as I was driving down across Oregon through Klamath and on my way to Red Bluff, I saw some lakes, mountain lakes that should have had a whole lot more water in them, and that problem is only getting more intense as we continue through this drought cycle that we're seeing in the Pacific Northwest. We're also seeing higher temperatures. I think everybody just coming off of the summer that we had realizes that we had some pretty high temperatures, and when you add in the high temperatures and the lack of precip, we're setting ourselves up for some pretty significant issues. But proper soil function could contribute and should contribute to mediating some of these extreme events. When we look at this chart that you're looking at, or this slide that you're looking at, we see a lot of soil erosion that takes place. In the upper right-hand corner, we see crusting and cracks forming. We see a tractor sunk to the axles, and I'm assuming that that's the Great Plains or the plains of Canada. I've actually seen a tractor when I was living up in Canada that was just about as deep as that. It's pretty impressive. But that, again, is the soil losing its functionality and not being able to do what it's supposed to do, what we expect it to do. So we can't go through an NRCS led discussion without talking about how does NRCS define soil health. And I think that probably most of you have been through a presentation that you've heard this, seen this, but NRCS's soil health definition is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that can sustain plants, animals, and humans. Now, when we talk about soil health, we're talking about improving the capacity of the soil to function as that vital ecosystem. When we think health, it's usually used in the context of living organisms. So when we think about managing soils, we're thinking about managing the optimum health in a way that ensures that the soil is sustainable and alive for future generations. The term health was purposely chosen. There was a whole work group, a focus group that talked about what is the different words that we can use for this soil health push from the NRCS. And health was chosen instead of quality because, when you think about quality, it implies analysis and quantifying. Health implies management actions. And that really, at the end of the day, is what it comes down to as we work with and interact with landowners that are making those management decisions that will lead to a condition or a state. It's something that we can do to change. And if needed, we can add a spin to it so that we have a positive trend. The key to the definition of soil health is that we have continued capacity. We can rejuvenate and then sustain that soil ecosystem. We have to remember that soil is a living ecosystem and recognize that the ground underneath us is something that can lose its functionality if management decisions are not made or made poorly. So, how well is your soil functioning? Does it feed and water your plants? It is something that we need to think about as we talk to and work with our producers. So At the third slide, I think, of the day, we talked about the history of cultivation. We started with hand tools, went to horse-drawn. We had the introduction of the steel plow in 1837, and then up to the tractors that had moldboard plows, and now we're up to a 40 or 60 foot implement that's being towed by a tractor that has more horsepower than farmers from back in the early 1900s could have ever imagined. But what are the general characteristics of cultivated soil? All along history, soil being cultivated is, at the end of the day, a disturbance activity that took place. So when we think about cultivated soils, we have a lower water infiltration and storage potential. We're decreasing the biological activity. We're decreasing the biological diversity. We're also decreasing the efficient nutrient cycling. The potential for weather extremes, temperature extremes to affect the soil ecosystem increases. We decrease the contribution to the vigor of the plants. We are increasing the erosion potential, and we're breaking down the soil structure potential and losing the aggregation of the soil. The productivity of conventional agriculture systems really have been maintained and made with the increases of technology. We talked about going from hand tools to a 60-foot implement that's pulled by a tractor. We have the ability to add nutrients. We have the ability to control weeds and pests with pesticides and herbicides. Sprinkler systems can be installed to add water to the soil system. But, at the end of the day, we need to figure out how we can better manage our soil. And potentially one of those ways is to get away from the cultivated soils that are decreasing so many of the natural processes. Okay, so let's talk about soils and how they function. So we have a soil functioning at 100% capacity, and then we have a disturbance event. What is the disturbance event? We have a hard rain, we have a tillage event. But let's talk about soil's resistance and resilience. And I just want to point out, I talked to Corey yesterday in a pre-meeting, and what I'm going to talk to you about is soil function. Corey's going to talk about resilience in an ecosystem and a climate scenario. So we have a disturbance event. Soil with high resistance is going to be a soil that has the ability to remain relatively unchanged when exposed to some sort of disturbance. Then we have a disturbance activity. And if we have a soil with a low resistance, so the soil can't remain relatively unchanged when exposed to a disturbance, but has a high resilience, that soil is going to be able to recover and pull itself back up to that pre-disturbance level. Resilience in a soil environment is the ability and rate of a soil to return to its pre-disturbance state. And again, Corey's going to discuss resilience from a climate perspective later today. So I just want to make sure that we're clear on what I'm saying. Relative resilience really depends on the underlying characteristics of a site or the landscape. That could include the climate, the soils, the type of vegetation. Resilience has been shown to increase with elevation and to differ among different vegetation types. If we think about that, higher precip areas, cooler temperatures, greater soil development, better plant productivity is going to result in a greater resource availability and more favorable environmental conditions for plant growth, which from an agricultural perspective, from a plant production perspective, and even from a livestock perspective, plant growth is really what we're looking at. If we can keep that ground covered, that is the benefit that we're focusing on. And in contrast, lower precip, higher temperatures result in lower available resources for plants, and we're going to see that at low elevations. Okay, so what happens when we have soil with a low resistance and low resilience? The soil doesn't have the ability to recover, to pull itself back up to that pre-disturbance state at a rapid amount of time, right? We said that resilience was the rate of soil as well as the ability of a soil to return to its pre-disturbance state. So what's the challenge? You know, the challenge is all of the conventional tillage that we've seen since this chart is saying since 1907. You know, we have lived with agricultural production, agriculture as a conventional tillage system for years and years and years. You know, when we think back to that earlier chart to the disturbance, this chart starting at that 1907. Right now, or let's see, 1940, let's say 1945, we were at 53% of the soil carbon stored in the soil as it was in 1907 when we started charting this disturbance rate. So what happened at about 1955? We had reduced tillage that started coming in. So reduced tillage, hopefully everybody's familiar with that term. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but reduced tillage really is getting away from inversion tillage. So we put the moldboard plow away and we started using some other form of tillage to open up the ground and allow us to get into the ground and make our plantings take place. So in 1990, if we look all the way over to the end of this red line, 1990, with the introduction of reduced tillage in about 1958, 1960, we've only gained a very small percentage back from our extreme low back in 1945. So once we lose it, it is a long, drawn-out process to recover it. So what is our challenge as ag professionals working with producers or as producers ourselves? What is the challenge? How do we regain soil function? So the challenge is that we need to figure out what resource concerns we're addressing, what inputs can be reduced to make the producer or the operation more viable, and is ag productivity sustainably maintained? Is it possible to achieve all three of these? Absolutely. And the way that we can obtain all three of these is by utilizing the 4 principles of soil health that NRCS has been using as the backdrop to the soil health message. So when we think about the 4 principles, really this is kind of a new way that we've been talking and discussing about what it is and how we utilize it. We have 2 different versions or 2 different sides of a circle, and you're going to scratch your head and say, Nick, it's a circle. They don't have sides. But think about it with a split right down the middle. We have protecting the soil, which is going to minimize disturbance and maximize soil cover. And we're going to talk about this more. And then we have the feeding the soil. So we're feeding and fueling the soil biology that is going to make the soil more viable. And by doing that, we're going to utilize the maximizing biodiversity and maximizing continuous living roots. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about what each side of this circle does, the feeding and the protection. And when we think about this, you know, we need to think about the biology that is in the soil. Soil organisms really are driving the benefits obtained through achieving and improving the condition of the principles. So as we think about it, the principles can be viewed from the perspective of how they benefit the entire soil ecosystem. All right. How do soil health principles support soil function through protection. Okay, so maintain stable aggregates. I think everybody understands and understands how soil is supposed to function, but we have the soil textural triangle as a structure, right? Sand, silt, and clay on each point, and a soil is made up of different levels of sand, silt, and clay combined and in a unit, in an aggregate. And if we can minimize the disturbance and maximize the soil cover, we're going to be able to maintain those aggregates. What we don't want to see is we don't want to see a disturbance event. Let's go back to a heavy rainfall scenario. We don't want to see a disturbance event that can break apart those aggregates and separate those three corners of the textural triangle into individual pieces. We don't want to see soil running down off the field, hitting the streams, the rivers, and clouding up the water, turning it muddy, and eventually at some point having soil deposition in those rivers, in those creeks, in those streams. We want to manage the erosion, and that manage erosion really was the Band-Aid that we used to put on as NRCS. You know, how many times have we seen terraces out in the field as we're driving around? You know, terraces really were to keep the water that rained down onto a field from leaving the field. But what happens if we address the soil functions so that the rain that comes down could go into the soil in place instead of forming a sheet erosion option or opportunity and then turning into a real erosion and pulling that soil out of the field where it doesn't do the farmer any good and it doesn't do the downstream effects or affected areas any good either. We can also buffer the temperature. You know, as we talk climate, it was a very hot, dry summer. If we have ground cover and we've minimized the disturbance, you know, that ground cover is going to help keep the soil cool by blocking the direct sun rays onto it. And then a covered soil is not going to heat up as fast as a bare soil. Reduce evaporation, and then also maintain soil organic matter. And when we think soil organic matter from a biology perspective, you know, that's what we need for the soil to actually function. If we don't have good soil organic matter, we're going to have a struggle with the soil biology completing their life processes. And if we don't have the soil biology completing their life processes, we're going to have trouble with this very first bullet on this, maintaining stable aggregates, in that we're not going to be able to form those aggregates or keep those aggregates formed if we don't have the ability for that soil biology to develop the, jump too quick, sorry, to develop the soil structure. All right, so a little more in depth, minimizing disturbance. Excessive or chronic disturbance is going to decrease the habitat for soil organisms and destroy that soil structure. So what types of disturbance are common in agriculture? I think if we were going to use the chat, everybody probably would use tillage. I call it iron toxicity. And when I say iron toxicity, I'm not talking the element iron. I'm talking about the implement that's hooked up behind the tractor that's going through and physically destroying the structure of the soil. We also have chemicals, you know, fertilizers, pesticides, soil amendments. All of those are going to have some impact on the natural soil environment and can be considered a disturbance to the soil. Biological, grazing, non-grazing, the fallow systems that we utilize, and the monoculture community. Monoculture communities, how many monoculture communities have you ever seen in a naturally undisturbed grassland? You know, there's never one type of plant out there. And you think, okay, you know, what does that matter? Well, when we think back to soil biology from a soil health perspective, what we want to see is we want to see diversity in the roots that are coming down into the soil. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but we want to see diversity in the roots that are pumping different exudates into the into the soil that are going to stimulate that biology. Okay, so what practices can we utilize to minimize disturbance? Residue and tillage management, conservation cover, nutrient management, integrated pest management, and prescribed grazing. And the numbers, if you're not familiar with them, I think most of you probably are, but the numbers at the back end are the NRCS practice codes. So if you're interested in more information, you can type into Google NRCS practice 329 and come up with some residue and tillage management practice standards, job sheets, etc. Okay, so as we think about minimizing disturbance, let's look at this chart down at the bottom, tillage and microbial activity. So we come in and we have a tillage event. And when we have the tillage event, we have this large spike in a conventional tilled system. And what's happening is we're introducing all that organic matter, we're introducing all that air, we're warming up the soil. And so the microbes just take off and they start breaking down that residue, that organic matter that's introduced into the system. Went the wrong way. Now, we don't see that in a no-till system, right? We don't see that big flush of microbial push breaking down. It's spread out over a longer period. So if I go back up, you can see the dotted line of the no-till system that extends. We don't have that very sharp drop off. We have a decrease, yeah, but we don't have that very sharp drop off that we see in the conventional system. So why do we need to maximize soil cover? It'll help decrease the erosion. It'll help increase the infiltration, decrease evaporation. It's going to moderate soil temperatures. It's going to improve the habitat for soil organisms, improve food for soil biota, and then it's also going to help mitigate compaction from machines and livestock. What practices can we utilize from an NRCS perspective that are going to maximize soil cover? We can utilize cover crop, again, residue and tillage management, conservation cover, mulching, controlled traffic farming, forage and biomass planting, and prescribed grazing. All of those can be utilized to maximize soil cover. All right, so now let's jump to the other side of that circle, the feed side of that circle. What principles can we use to support the feeding of soil functions? We want to stimulate that below ground diversity. We want to make the environment hospitable for the biology that we see and need in the ground. By doing that, we're going to increase the soil organic matter. And when we increase the diversity below ground, we're also going to improve the potentials for nutrient cycling. We're going to improve the ability for soil microbes to break down that residue that's left and make those nutrients that are in the soil plant available so the next round of plants can utilize them and be healthy and happy. We're also going to be able to break pest cycles and then increase predator and pollinator populations. So how do we maximize living roots? We change how we see the system. We grow crops in the off season. And in this area, you know, I just actually got done with an interview that I was sitting on a panel for the research leader out at Pendleton, and they were talking about our environments, our climate, and how cover crops fit into it. And it's changing the way that we see how our growing environment functions is how we're going to maximize the living roots. If we can figure out how to fit these crops in the off season, how to make it fit and make it work so that we're improving the soil quality and minimizing the potential for loss for the next cash crop, that is going to be the win-win for soil health. We're going to try to avoid that fallow system, and we're going to try to lower that recropping interval. We want to increase the time in perennial crops if possible. You know, not every operation has that opportunity, but again, change the way we see the growing environment that we're working in. And then we want to manage rotations and forage height. If we were doing a grazing presentation, we'd get into the above ground utilization and how that matters for the below ground root growth. And just for working knowledge and walk and talk and discussion purposes, if you decrease the above ground biomass past 50%, you are instantly decreasing the potential for root growth. And actually the plant is going to start sloughing off roots that are down there because it doesn't need that mass to utilize the growth above ground. So once you pass that 50% mark of grazing utilization, you start to see plant health issues because the root biomass that is feeding that soil environment is going to start decreasing. So what practices can we use to maximize living roots? Conservation crop rotation, conservation cover, cover crops, forage and biomass plantings, prescribed grazing can all be utilized for maximizing living roots. So biodiversity, the fourth area of that circle, how do we maximize biodiversity? We want to grow diverse cover crops and legumes, right? I said earlier that how many monocultures have we ever seen in nature? Very, very few. I can't tell you one that I've ever seen that was just a straight monoculture. But in cropping systems and agriculture, that's what the goal is. We don't want plants that aren't supposed to be there in the field at the time that we are growing an agricultural crop. We need to increase the diversity of our crop rotations. Monoculture really is the structure of how our agriculture works, but is there an opportunity to use some intercropping? Some piola is a little popular right now, growing peas and canola at the same time. How can we manipulate our cropping systems? How can we see our cropping systems differently so that we can increase the diversity of not only the roots that are growing down and the biomass that's growing up, but just the break and disease cycles, the pest pressures? How can we see it differently? We can integrate livestock and graze those cover crops. And not only is that a good thing for stimulating soil biology, when you think about the urine and the manure that we have from the livestock coming through, we also have that hoof and trampling action that we see when livestock is grazing cover crop. They're eating half of it and mashing half of it down into the soil and getting some soil biology straight to the plant, and it's able to start breaking down that biomass. That again is another good positive. And it used to actually be one of the add-ons to our 4 principles of soil health, introduce livestock into the system. And now, as we think about it, it's not that it's not in the system anymore, but we really look at that integration of livestock as NRCS talks it now, into this maximizing biodiversity. We're putting back what nature had in the system originally. So what practices can we use for this maximizing biodiversity? Again, conservation crop rotation, conservation cover, which is a perennial system, a permanent ground cover crop, which is an annual planted crop that is taken out every year. Forage and biomass plantings, a perennial system. Integrated pest management. Our management practices are going to increase in diversity and complexity as we add these different principles of soil health. And prescribed grazing, again, is going to be key for maximizing biodiversity.
Nick, we have a question in the chat asking, can you comment on how these principles are applied in a rangeland system?
Sure. So in a rangeland system, we have the benefit, hopefully we have the benefit of being without being a monoculture. So hopefully we don't have enough disturbance activities. And, if we think back to that chart that I showed, earlier, the graph that I showed earlier when we were talking resilience and resistance, you know, having a lack of invasive species coming into a rangeland system is going to help maintain the diversity of the system. And again, when we have diversity in the system, we have adequate and good functioning ground cover. We have good diversity. We have living roots that are growing down into the soil. The range system is hopefully functioning so that we're taking sunlight down through the plants, pumping out root exudates, and building that soil microbial environment, and is able to help process all of that organic matter and make the soil system productive for those range environments. So adopting soil health practices is not just I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do. It makes me feel warm and fuzzy. You know, we have to, as ag professionals that are working with producers and then producers, we have to understand the physical resource data, but we also have to understand the social data. You know, it is not just I'm going to do it because I feel like doing it. You know, all of these landowners, all of these land operators are doing this as a profession, as a livelihood. We have to understand what we're telling them or asking them to do, and we also have to understand what they're thinking about, what they're seeing, and how they operate as they start adopting these soil health practices. Awareness and understanding is key to human and social economic considerations and can assist with the implementation and long-term adoption. So if we understand where they're coming from, how it can benefit, and we can explain how it can benefit their entire operation, and we start small, you know, we don't have to implement on the whole farm field. We can start small and be their biggest cheerleader as they encounter positives, and be a shoulder to cry on and a resource to come up with reasons why potentially something didn't work on their operation. You know, again, it's how we look at the system that is going to lead to that long-term adoption. So, you know, I'm going to ask you to think about, again, you don't have to type it in the chat, but I'm going to ask you to think about, you know, what is the current perception of soil health in your region, and what is keeping people from implementing, and has anybody in your area overcome some of these obstacles that you've thought about, you've heard? You know, one of the biggest ones that I've heard is cover crops in the Pacific Northwest will never work. Absolutely will never work. Well, you know, I'll go back and say, okay, cover crops in our area won't work with the way that we look at agriculture right now. But before the tractors became popular, before everybody had multiple tractors in their equipment yard, how was all that cultivation? How was all that work done? How was all the harvesters pulled? It was pulled by mule teams, horse teams, oxen. How did we feed the mule teams, the horse teams, and oxen? We didn't go to the gas station and grab a bale of hay. You know, we had to grow cover crops in order to feed the horsepower that we utilized in earlier days. You know, cover crops have been. It's just we've changed our perception of how we address soil and production management. So, yep, go ahead.
Sorry, Nick, we have a comment and a question in one. It says old school fallow systems were based on the fallow year being when the soil collected water for the next crop. How do you change the landowner's minds to grow a cover crop and assure them it won't use up all of their moisture?
That's great. So the way we address that is we start thinking about the evapotranspiration, right? So we think about what is the loss that we see from the stored moisture. And I know you can't see me because I turned my camera off, but the stored moisture, and I have my hands up doing air quotes, of a fallow year. So even if it is a fallow year, even if we're not actively growing a crop up and out, we still have the natural environment. And let's go back to climate change. We have the extreme heat temperatures of our summers coming down and baking that soil surface. Well, a traditional fallow or even a chem fallow that doesn't have any living plants growing in it is going to get hotter, warmer. And when it gets hotter and warmer, we're going to lose that soil moisture up and out of the system. And so if we start thinking, what can a cover crop do? We're going to grow a crop through the, let's throw a scenario on it from a crop production perspective in a Pacific Northwest environment, low rainfall environment. We're going to plant a cover crop after harvest. It's going to germinate and grow up in the wintertime, fall, autumn, hopefully live under a snowpack. And, depending on what species we put into that cover crop, we might see some winter kill, but we're going to have that cover crop still there in the spring. We have opportunities for livestock to utilize that cover crop for forage. So that's an economic driver for the producer potentially. And then we can terminate that cover crop when a typical spring package that we would normally see a weed or an herbicide application take place if we don't get 100% utilization by the livestock introduced into the system. And we terminate it before we lose any of that stored moisture potential. And when we terminate it, what we're doing is also building up soil organic matter. So when we do get future rain events, we have a higher water holding capacity in the soil. So the long-term events, the long-term adoption is going to be, beneficial to the soil environment. And by reducing the input potentials of nutrients being needed, because we have biological processes taking place and transforming those nutrients into plant ready or plant available forms, we can hopefully potentially get to the point that we're adding less inputs, which is going to be an economic driver as well. And I see another chat thing popped up. Is there something else that we should address before we move forward?
It's more of a comment, I think,
Okay.
on information than a question. Go ahead.
All right. Okay, so let's think about the core practices that we discussed as we talked about the feed and the protect sides or areas of the soil health circle. Conservation crop rotation, we're going to start with that, 328. So the principles: reduce disturbance, increase the cover, increase diversity, and increase the roots in the soil. So with conservation crop rotation, we're increasing the cover, the diversity, and the roots. Conservation cover, wow, that fits all four of the principles of soil health. Cover crop, again, it covers the ground, so we're protecting, but then it also feeds. We have diversity and we have roots in the system. Residue tillage management, we are reducing the disturbance, we're increasing the cover, and we're increasing the diversity. Mulching, again, same thing, disturbance, cover, diversity. Nutrient management, we're reducing the disturbance because we have the potential for soil biology to manage the nutrients that are in the soil. Prescribed grazing, all four of them. And again, diversity is where we're putting livestock introduction. So we have the diversity of the livestock coming into the system. They're not only helping break down those plant materials and getting the plant organic matter contact with the soil, where the soil biology can start manipulating them. And if you were in Joe's talk, he'd be talking about biological engineers like earthworms, pulling that organic matter down into the soil system. But you're here with me and I appreciate it. Pasture and hayland planting. Now you see on this one that disturbance is highlighted. And the reason disturbance is highlighted is that depending on how the establishment is set up, it may not eliminate or address disturbance. But when we think about pasture and hayland planting, perennial plantings, in the long game, again, the soil health journey, not goal, the soil health journey, we're going to see that the long game, we're going to reduce disturbance. IPM 595, we're going to see a decrease in disturbance and an increase in diversity. All right, so soil biology, we've been talking about it, all day long. You've probably talked about it in daily conversations, I'm sure, because everybody loves soil health. But let's think about the simplified food web. So we have plants growing, plants utilize sunlight to perform photosynthesis. As the plants are performing photosynthesis, they're producing root exudates. The root exudates are going down into the soil and they're attracting the microfauna. They're attracting the soil biology, the bacteria and the fungi. Now, as we have diversity in our system, as we have this root exudates coming down, as we have the roots in the system, the organic matter introduced into the soil environment, we're attracting these different biological entities. And as we attract these different biological entities, they're completing their life cycle. The more diversity, the longer that we can have roots growing. We're going to see these bacteria, these fungi completing their life processes. They're going to reproduce, replicate. The higher feeders are going to be feeding on the lower feeders. And then we get into the environmental engineers, the earthworms. They're going to be pulling that organic matter down in to get in contact so the bacteria and the fungi can utilize that. All of these entities within the soil food web are going to be helping break down organic matter, release nutrients into the system, and further or benefit the soil environment. So I think everybody has probably seen one version or another of this slide. Soils host vast numbers of organisms. So in 1 cubic meter, and I converted it 1.3 yards cubed of topsoil, we're going to see basically the weight of 20 cows worth of biology living in the soil. So in 1.3 yards of topsoil, we're going to see over 2.5 acres or a hectare, we're going to see the weight of 20 cows in the biological activity, biological organisms that are in that soil, working and processing the nutrients. I think everybody has heard one version or another that soils host 25% of the Earth's biodiversity. And the unfortunate part is that we only understand about 10% of what is in the soil and what they actually do from a plant microbe animal interaction. That's pretty amazing. We know more about the stars than we do about what our soils do and what our soil organisms do in the soil. And the soil is something that we stand on every day. Okay, so when we think about soil, when we think about soil health, think about it as a stair step. We have biological activity down at the bottom. That is the goal. We want to see biological activity stimulated. The 4 principles of soil health are going to lead to that stimulation of biological activity. When we see that, we're going to see the organic matter turnover. When we see the organic matter turnover and the biological activity, we're going to see improved nutrient cycling. And once we see that improved nutrient cycling, then we're going to start seeing noticeable changes. We're going to see improved soil structure. We're going to see improved aggregate stability. And when we see that, we're going to see improved water availability because we're going to be able to get that water infiltrated down into the soil environment. We're going to be able to store it because we have more soil carbon, soil organic matter in the system. and the plants are going to be able to utilize it. And when the plants are able to utilize it, they're going to be more productive, more lush, producing more biomass, producing more root mass, and stimulate that biological activity even more. Okay, so really quickly, tools of the trade. You know, as a professional, you are always the smartest person out in the field when you pack your shovel with you. When you dig down and look at what the soil is doing, what the soil looks like. Knives, water, sink strainers, infiltration rings, be able to take notes, cameras, if you have it, your color book, you know, be able to go out into the field, talk the talk and walk the walk and understand what you're looking at, what you're thinking about. And when we go out and look at the soil with our producers, we need to be looking at soil cover, surface crusting, residue breakdown, roots and pores, are they there? Aggregate stability, use the slake test, use the slump test, biological activity. Do we see biology? You know, at some level, we're going to be able to see biology. If it's there, we're going to be able to see it. Penetration resistance and soil structure. You know, do we have ponding? Can we get a penetrometer in the ground? Can we get a wire flag in the ground? And what's the soil color? You know, out in the middle of the field, what's the soil color compared to the edge of the field? All right. So
Nick,
that
I
have one more slide, I think.
Perfect.
Yep. Okay. So that is the out in the field. That is the talking. We can't do everything that we need to explain soil health when we're out in the field. You know, a shovel will make you look awful smart, but taking a soil sample and sending it into the lab and looking at the indicators for soil health really is going to be a good spot for starting that conversation or maintaining that conversation for soil health and looking at the trends. So as we think about it, lab indicators for soil health, you know, we have different tests running down the left-hand side. And I just want to give a quick plug. You know, the OSU Soil Health Lab can do these tests and more tests. If you need more information on this, Tech Note, NRCS Tech Note 45003 is going to be your best friend. It goes in and talks in more depth what these lab indicators are going to look like. So things to remember: adopting soil health conservation systems is a long-term investment. We can degrade soils overnight. We can degrade soils over the long run. Improving soil health is going to be over the long run. We see agronomic benefits that are going to result in economic benefits, and we need to be able to help producers quantify that. And when we think about working with producers for a soil health management system, we need to have that conversation to find out what works best for a producer, given their objectives and their goals. And with that, I am done. Thank you for being here and participating.
Thanks, Nick. I think there will be time for questions later on. For now, I think they're waiting for us in the larger room, and everyone can leave the breakout session now.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you all.